Welcome back and good morning. This is News Center. Now, as promised, we want to focus on the global climate crisis. Following that report released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientists have warned that food production around the world will suffer as global heating reaches 1.5 degrees Celsius. We just want to take a look at the current situation coming from that report. The findings is that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land. It has also scaled off recent changes across the climate system as a whole, and present state of many aspects of the climate system are unprecedented over many centuries to many thousands of years. This is the current situation when it comes to climate change. Also, many changes due to past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible for centuries to millennia, especially changes in the ocean, ice sheets and global sea levels. Of course, this is some of the findings coming up or out of that report. We will take a look at what the future holds. But before we have that conversation, our reporter Daniel Kariuki spoke to the Nyeri County Speaker on a climate bill that was recently passed by the MCAs. Listen in before we get to that conversation.
Of course, recently, President Uhuru Kenyatta was in the United Kingdom for a 3-day tour, where he also participated in matters to do with climate. And days later, a report has been released by the UN, and it is sending some warning to all the people in the world that the risk to die if the ongoing climate disruptions are going to continue, and of course they are saying that it is going to be frequent. And in Nyeri County recently, a bill concerning climate change was passed, and now is law. And I want to discuss these matters to do with that bill and matters climate change with the Speaker of the County Assembly of Nyeri, Mr. Kagusha, who is going to tell us more concerning this bill that is now law. Thank you very much. Of course, it's great of concern matters to do with climate, and we have been seeing reports every now and then concerning even emissions, and that our climate is changing, and this climate change all over is going to cause havoc in the entire world. And of course, County Assembly having passed this into a climate change bill into law. Maybe you can just tell us briefly concerning that bill, or that law, rather.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we have a very big challenge globally speaking, because the climate is changing in a very fast way and in an unprecedented manner. And what we have seen is very far-reaching effect and impact of this climate change. You have global warming, and this, in many ways, has disrupted even the seasons that we have. Before, you know, we used to know that we have big rains or long rains, and then we had short rains. And now that has been disrupted, and you find that even areas where we used to have less rain, we have more rain now, which sometimes brings devastation because of flooding and also earth movement. And then in other areas, we have drought throughout, and these are areas where we used to enjoy fairly good rainfall. And so this, in a big way, has disrupted many livelihoods, and also continues to bring on board issues to do with pests, diseases, and also even human illnesses that never really disturbed us earlier on. You saw the phenomena that we had recently where we had locusts, and I think this phenomena is ongoing at the moment. All these is as a result of climate change, and this is disrupting lives. And this is being caused by emissions, which are uncontrolled because of manufacturing and because of increased human activities in the world and in the globe. And the fact that countries are developing at a very fast rate, and then populations are also growing at a very big rate. And that also means that people have invaded the forest cover, and they have also invaded even the green areas that in the past absorbed all these emissions and the carbon dioxide that was produced in the air. So what Nyeri County has seen is that it has looked ahead and seen that this is a challenge that is facing our people. And for that reason, the county has come up with a climate change bill. And this climate change bill sets a fund, a climate fund in this county, which is going to devote finances and funds to activities that are going to promote on climate change mitigation. And so this means that every time the county is going to be allocating money for its budget, then it's going to be allocating certain funds which are going to go to the climate change. And then that also means that the county with this kind of a fund is also able now to look for donor funding and for other stakeholders who have an interest in climate change mitigation plans. And this also means that there is a way that we are able to directly promote climate change mitigation plans and strategies right across the county and on the ground with the people who are much more involved. Now, if we do this, we are going to hopefully increase the forest cover. We are going to increase the green areas in our county. We are going to ensure that all the emissions that are emitted from industries and from manufacturing zones are going to be absorbed by our forest cover. And that anything that we do, including tilling of land, is going to be done in ways that promote good practices that mitigate against climate change and the effects of climate change. Right. Now, this also helps us also to deal with global issues, because if we produce more components that are able to absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it means that the countries that are also emitting much more we are also able now to get to absorb this carbon dioxide that is being produced from those countries. That also now helps us to get into the carbon credit business, which will help this county to get certain concessions and resources that have to promote the issue of carbon credits as a county. So it's a bill that now it's a law which has already been enacted in this county that is going to help us to be able to bring together resources and be able to come up with targeted strategies which are going to help us improve the environment around this county.
That is Daniel Kariuki with the Nyeri County Speaker talking about that climate bill that was recently passed by MCAs in that county. And I want us to continue with that conversation here in studio. And I'm now joined by Benson Ocheng, an environment law expert, to discuss more about the effects of climate change and measures to mitigate the same. Good morning, Benson. Thank you very much for making time to join us here on News Center. Just picking up from that and from that report and the findings where people are saying this is supposed to be a wake-up call for governments to take action. But we have been saying this year in, year out. Are we on the right track, really?
Thank you very much, Ashley. It's always good to be here. Whether we are on the right track or not must be determined by specific indicators on what we are doing as a country. And I think Kenya has done very well. The speaker there just mentioned, one of your colleagues, that the president was in the UK sometime last week. And that is part of what is going on as preparations for the conference of parties that is coming up in November. It indicates our commitment to the global agenda of addressing climate change. I must also observe that during those meetings, Kenya scored very highly in terms of its performance in what we call nationally determined contributions. This is the set of commitments that each country, following the agreement of the Paris Accord in 2015, each country committed to have national targets for addressing climate change, and it presented that to the UNFCCC, which is the framework convention governing climate change. And this time around, countries were supposed to show how much they are doing in terms of achieving those commitments, and Kenya did very well, as I observed. You remember that in this country in 2016, we were the first country in the region to pass climate-specific legislation in the form of Climate Change Act. I think we sort of went ahead of ourselves in doing it because the ambition was so high. We formulated what we call a Climate Change Council. And for better or for worse, we put the president as the chair of the council, and that has been a challenging element in that legislation because, as you know, the president has so much and doesn't just chair any meeting. The ambition was to put the concern at the highest level. Beside that, we have a national climate change policy. We are one of the first countries to have a climate finance policy. And generally, we are also performing very well in terms of developing mechanisms for climate finance. At the end of the day, you need money to address this problem. So let me say that we are on the right track. We could do more. There is always room for improvement, but Kenya is doing very well, and that is known globally. That is why we are always invited at the table. The other day, when Biden came into office and appointed the former Secretary of State as the climate czar, you know that our president was one of the few African presidents, just among 5, who were invited to that Global Climate Leaders Summit, which was the first major action of President Biden when he came into office. So we are doing well. We can pat ourselves on the back.
All right. Yes, we are doing well when it comes to the act, when it comes to policies. But what about implementation? Because this is where the problem is. If you have policies, you have to implement them. So then are we doing well in terms of implementation?
You're very right, actually. Implementation is actually the test in the test of the pudding. And I think when we talk implementation, we always have to think, what is the mechanism for ensuring implementation? We were minded enough to put under Section 19 of the Climate Change Act that climate action will be carried out at the county level. And of course, for you to be able to implement matters at county level, and particularly issues that require money, you need county legislation. And I think that is what Speaker Kariuki was speaking about there. So county governments have a responsibility under the law to formulate and put in place mechanisms for implementation. Climate action is a global problem, but action must be taken at the local level, and that is what Section 19 of that Act was seeking to do. So county governments are enjoined to formulate legislation for climate action at the local level. And in as much as it's good to give credit to Nyeri, I think they are the 32nd among 47 counties to pass climate legislation. And this is why there is a lot of focus on what counties need to do and must do to be the locus of activity in addressing climate action, because as the report indicates, it is the climate change is caused by human influence, human activities on the environment, and these activities happen at local level. And so in terms of action, there is a lot of global effort to do this. As you know, climate financing in this country is the responsibility of the National Treasury. The National Treasury has recently managed to negotiate for a big loan cum grant, let's call it, from the World Bank. I think it is one of the hugest segments of bilateral funding, multilateral funding that is coming to Kenya under the World Bank kitty. And there is a particular program that is called Financing Locally Led Climate Action that is going to drive activity in this area. And one of the things that county governments ought to do right now is to ensure that they have this legislation to create climate change fund at county level, to earmark or ring-fence a certain section of county development budget to support climate finance or climate action. And counties, some are doing well, some have been ambitious enough to talk of 2% of that budget, some are doing 1%, as you know, they are competing needs. So through such efforts, I hope that this matter would be addressed. And there is also another element in these finances that you set up the Climate Change Fund in line with the, of course, Public Finance Act. And if it meets the conditions, then you are ready to go. One important aspect in this is the role of private sector. And the world is not going to address this unless the private sector plays a big role. And that is why you see a lot of investment right now is going into clean energy or low carbon emission options. And there is very little funding, even with major multilateral funds like the World Bank and IMF, onto issues like oil exploration and use of fossil fuels like coal. And that is why we may be soon stuck with our much talked about discovery of oil in Turkana and, of course, coal in the Mui Basin. That is why you see globally a company like Tesla all of a sudden scores very highly from 6 billion worth just a few years ago to over 200 billion currently. And the trend is continuing, so it means that renewable energy options for investment seem to be scoring the biggest. In this country, it has been recently noted, for example, that Kenya Commercial Bank has become one of the first banks to be accredited for green finance. Mm-hmm. And even these institutions, particularly the banking sector, are required to comply and be sustainable, and a lot of them are driving this agenda. So through similar actions and efforts, and if we have the right conditions, the right policies, and the right institutions, we would be on the path to ensuring that we address this problem at local level.
Okay.
And we take the necessary actions to address climate change.
Okay, before we continue talking about financing this, I want us to go back to that report and the findings. They're saying that many changes due to past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible. But then, can they be slowed down? If so, how?
Yeah, definitely. If you go deeper into the report, you see that it's talking about within 20 years, and the world reaching possibly that, we call it tipping point, the stabilization point of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Mm-hmm. Currently, the average increase in global temperature stands at around about 1.1 degrees Celsius as compared or relative to the pre-industrial levels. The year usually taken is 1800, when the Industrial Revolution set in. And that is very important because that is the key ambition, even in the Paris Agreement, that the main agenda and main ambition for the world now is to stabilize global temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we have a window of just 2 decades. 20 years, that is not a long time by any standard. So if we are in 2021, we are talking of 2040. Many of us, most probably us, will still be alive. That is, if COVID doesn't take us away.
Yeah.
But all the same, you can see that it's a very short-term span. And what the report is also saying is that what already exists in the atmosphere right now, which on average is something like 2.4 trillion tons of carbon, and the increment usually is like about 400 billion per year. And so if you take that, it means that the tipping point or that threshold will be reached in 20 years if you add another, 800 million. So it has to be there. The world has to keep it at an average of 1.5, because if it goes beyond that, then the changes become irreversible. And then it means that we will be approaching an apocalyptic scenario where we can do nothing to reverse the trends. So the hope is that the world can start stabilizing, actually go to kind of a net zero production of CO2 into the atmosphere and then stabilize it there. So that is the ambition, and that is why the world is having what is called the Zero Carbon Coalition and many of these efforts, where basically countries are committing to reach a limit on a threshold where they will not add any more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that is very important, but it's a very challenging fact because it affects production and consumption systems in the world and economic growth. The UK has been trying this when the current Prime Minister came into office. He's been trying to commit to a certain policy on this, and you know, even in the US is a big debate, in China is a big issue because and I mean, in as much as countries like Kenya are contributing almost zero in terms of per capita contribution to climate change, the global trend and the impacts of climate change is global. So everyone must do whatever little. But let me add, for developing countries like Kenya and those in Africa, the main issue is what we call adaptation. How do we cope in spite of the changes that are occurring, some of which are irreversible? It means that communities and societies will have to adapt, which means basically putting measures in place to be able to cope in spite of the changes, some of which are irreversible, that are occurring and that will continue to occur. That is the main issue. But again, the other side of the coin is that everyone must do the little they can to address the problem. It reminds you of what the late Wangari Maathai used to say, soul rest in peace.
Yeah.
She used to talk about the story of the hummingbird, where a forest was burning and the animals were running and crying, and there is this little hummingbird that kept running to the river, fetching water with its beak and dropping it on the forest, and the rest of the animals were laughing. But she said, okay, it's fine, you guys keep laughing, but at least I'm doing something.
Yes.
You can always apply this in the situation of climate change.
Okay.
It matters what each one of us does, from simple things of switching off lights to trying to switch, do what we call fuel switch. If you use firewood,
Yeah.
you can look for better options that are cleaner to cook your food and the rest of those things.
Okay, and I want to pick it up from where you left it off. You say that we need to stabilize this and human activities need to change. But how exactly do we cope if most of Kenyans are even oblivious to the issue of climate change?
Well, this is one case where ignorance is no defense, because whether you know or you don't know, you are likely to perish from the vagaries of the impacts of this event. And because you are addressing issue of knowledge and capacity, I think we need to start there. People need the information. Not that these communities don't know. They are seeing the changes happening in their backyard. I mean, we are having more severe droughts than used to be. We are having more in floods of greater intensity like we have seen recently, particularly in the areas around the lake region, but also the rest of the country. And there are huge crop losses. I mean, worldwide you can see this and communities can feel it. And so what they need is to be told exactly and be educated on what is happening. And particularly, we need options for coping. Like in the case of a drought, you see communities losing herds of cattle and crops. And this is where the private sector options that we talked about come in handy, that banks and financial institutions need to be more innovative in the kind of instruments that they can avail, like insuring livestock and crops, and running away from the business and as usual run-in-the-mill kind of ways of doing business. That is very important. And that is why we keep saying the private sector has a big role to play, and the banks and financial institutions, the insurance companies can do a lot. If you go elsewhere in some parts of the world, there are a lot of financial instruments already tailor-made to address this problem. Unfortunately, in this part of the world, we are still steeped deep into the traditional modes of doing business, and that undermines our ability to cope, and we will be much the worse if we don't adapt to some of these new instruments.
Okay, that's a very good place to end it. Thank you very much, Benson Ocheng, environment law expert. Take home, we need to find options. You need to read about climate change. What exactly are you doing wrong? But as we continue this conversation, let's now cross over to Voi and hear what residents say about climate change.
Well, weather and climate change has negatively impacted on agricultural and conservation activities across the world. And here in Taita Taveta today, we'll be engaging stakeholders, maybe to share with us what are possible solutions and maybe what are possible causes of the increasing effect on weather and climate across the world. Na nyinyi kama washikadau wa mazingira, swala hili limetatiza vipi swala zima la mazingira?
Naitwa Alfred Monake, mimi ni mratibu wa Taita Taveta Wildlife Conservancy Association. Ni association inayoleta 33 ranches ama conservancies hapa katika eneo ya Savo pamoja na kuweza kufanya miradi aina kama ya mifugo ya tourism, na hata ya mambo mengine kama carbon projects. Swala la kuhusu climate change ni jambo liko na sisi sasa, na ni jambo la kutatiza, na ni jambo tusipoangalia inaweza kutumiza sisi na kuumiza wale vizazi vijao. Na kwa ajili ukiangalia effects zake ni kwamba climate change inafanya kwamba zile resources tunazotegemea zikaweza kudorora. Kama ukiangalia resource ya maji imeweza kupotea, ile chemichemi zile zilizokuwa kitambo zimeweza kupotea kwa ajili ya ile ukataji wa miti, uharibifu wa mazingira. Ile uharibifu wa mazingira sasa imefanya kwamba hali ya anga ama kuwa na mbadiliko katika vile mvua ulikuwa unanyesha kitambo, sio vile unaonyesha kwa sasa. Hata mvua unapokuja unapata kwamba ni ile mvua inayonyesha hapa na kule, ile tunaitanga sporadic rainfall, na kwamba si sehemu zote zinaweza pata kunyeshewa na zikaweza miti ikaweza kuleta maua, na ile cycle ya kimaisha ikaweza kufanyika vile inatakikana kuweza kufanyika. Shida ingine ya climate change sasa unaangalia kwamba sasa watu, sababu ya ile population growth, watu wanalazimika kuingia na kuanza kuishi, wakaweza kukata miti ili waweze kupata maeneo ya kuishi ama waweze kufanya upanzi, mambo na agriculture. Ukapata kwamba sasa ile imeharibu mazingira, landslides zinatokea kwa sababu kama hayo. Mambo na hizi mioto ile inayotokea mbugani inatokea sababu sasa ile jua inakuwa kali zaidi ya kuweza kufanya moto kaweza kuwaka,
na ni jambo ambalo limechangia sana sana migogoro kati ya binadamu na wanyamapori. Manake wakati hali ya anga imebadilika, wakati mwingine tunakuwa na ile kitu ambayo tunaita prolonged drought, ama kiangazi ambacho kinaenda kwa muda mrefu, na hiyo inafanya the resources ambazo hawa wanyama wanarely on ama wanategemea zinakauka. Kwa mfano maji yanakauka kwenye visima, nyasi ama malisho ya hawa wanyamapori yanaisha. Unakuta kwamba hawa wanyama wanapoishiwa na vyakula na vinywaji vyao, wanatoka na kwenda kwenye mashamba ya watu, na wale communities pia ambao hawana kitu ambacho wanatoa kwenye mashamba yao sababu hali ya anga pia imebadilika, wanajaribu nao kurudi kwa uwindaji ndio wapate kipato. Kwa hivyo mswada mzima wa climate change umeaffect ama umeathiri sana kwanza ukulima ambao unaathiri ufugaji pia wa mifugo, na unaathiri pia uhifadhi wa wanyama. Kwa hivyo hizo ni baadhi ya athari ambazo zinapatikana specifically hapa kwenye hii area ya Taita Taveta. Sisi kama shirika tumekuja na mipangilio tofauti tofauti ya uhifadhi wa zile misitu ama zile mbuga ambazo zinatumika sana sana kwa kutoa maji. Mfano tuko na misitu hapa area ya Taita Taveta, kwa mfano tunayo Kitobo, Vulia kule. Tuna mikakati ambayo itaendelea ama ambayo tunafanya kuhakikisha kwamba hizi misitu ama haya mazingira yanahifadhiwa na hakuna uharibifu kwenye haya misitu, kwenye misitu hiyo, manake maji yanatoka kwenye hizo areas.
Unaona hatari iko wapi kwa siku zijazo, pengine katika miaka inayokuja, endapo kama swala hili litakuwa wananchi na mashirika na serikali watakuwa wameshindwa kulikabili kwa sasa?
Mikakati ambayo inafaa kuwekwa sasa hivi ni kuhakikisha kwamba kila mwananchi anaweza kuadapt to that system, lakini athari zitazidi kuwa kubwa. Kwa mfano kama kiangazi kitazidi kuwa, tunaweza poteza ukulima wetu, tutapoteza hata wanyama wetu, na pia mbuga zetu za wanyama zote zitapotea. Mito huenda ikakauka kama hatutahifadhi misitu, na hapo tunakosa maji, na wajua pia maji ni uhai. Kwa hivyo tukikosa maji sisi wote tunaangamia. So kama hakuna mikakati ya kufanya either adaptation ama kujaribu ya kuregesha misitu kwenye ile hali ya kawaida, tutakuwa na shida sana in future. Manake pia tutapoteza wanyama wengi ambao ni what we call endangered species ambazo zinategemea hizo areas. So the effect zitakuwa kubwa sana, manake tutapoteza wanyama, tupoteze ukulima, tupoteze mifugo na mito pia ikauke na hatutakuwa na maisha ya kuishi.
Well, and those are conservation stakeholders here in Taita Taveta County sharing their opinion and concerns and the possible solution on how to curb the increasing weather and climate change. Reporting for KTN News from Voi, I'm Hezron Kimari.
Thank you, Hezron Kimari, for that. Remember, this climate change issue is one that we really need to discuss, not just here, but even as we congregate in our various public interactions. Now, we want to take a short break here on News Center. When we come back, that story that tomorrow the government has set aside, the parliament actually has set aside government business to discuss a motion by the Orange Democratic Party asking the government to eliminate all forms of lockdowns, curfews and travel restrictions. We'll be having this conversation with Mvita Member of Parliament Abdul Somad Nasir. So stay tuned. You can always text your questions if you want them asked. Now, we'll be back shortly.
This is KTN News.